culture is much more than just having a nice kind of picture with some values on it. Startup is quite different. There's no 9 to 5. There's pick your own commitments, do what you can do, be open, be transparent. You learn only by doing mistakes or by making mistakes. Look for people who are resilient and who are adaptive, because you cannot foresee the future.
Like what do you think the biggest challenges are? What is the hardest thing in today's market about hiring a great data person?
At the moment, the biggest challenge is to find the right candidates with the right knowledge and the soft skills. So this combination of having somebody who's capable of fulfilling the task itself, basically coding or fulfilling the role of a CTO or whatever, and having the right soft skills is really very, very hard at the moment.
And so is it the case that there's just fundamentally not that many candidates who have that overlap in skills? Like you tend to have one or the other, or is it some other problem, do you think?
Yes, there are not so many candidates who have the skills in both areas, let's say. So meaning on the one hand side, proper knowledge. On the other hand side, also having the soft skills that you need to fulfill the job. That is one problem. And obviously, I think we have a change at the moment of expectations for those roles, right? So if back in the day, a data scientist basically was good enough fulfilling the role, today I see with us, but also with other companies, that the expectation is that they have to be also good communicators. So basically, they have to communicate what they want. They have to interact with the team. They have to play an active role, not only in IT, but with various teams, be it marketing, sales, purchasing, whatever. And if they cannot do this, there's a big problem.
I wonder if as like AI takes off and maybe some of the technical aspects of the jobs start to get a little bit easier, maybe like there's a lower barrier to build something basic or do some kind of analysis. If ChatGPT could now write your code that's sort of, 80% good enough. Mm-hmm. I wonder if then there's going to be a bigger pool of candidates available in a sense, because now you've got the sort of higher, softer skills people leveraging AI with like enough data science knowledge to get by. What do you reckon?
That's a very good question. Actually, I don't know that. It's a little bit hard to look into the glass bowl to see what will happen. I can imagine that it happens, but on the other hand side, let's not forget that even if GPT is taking over some of the coding, which I think is very likely, if you ask me, still we need people with proper education for many jobs. So if we talk data science, at least. So data science never will be something like a kind of a do-it-yourself thing. I don't think so. Yeah, you need to have a proper education in some way or another, and meaning. So even if GPT is taking over some of this, still on the other hand side, there is education needed for the data scientists to become proper communicators.
And so you mentioned, a lack of candidates who maybe have both sides of the coin, the softer skills, the technical skills. Is there anything else that's kind of jumping out as a big challenge at the moment in hiring data people in your eyes?
One thing I think is pretty obvious is that at the moment, the economic situation is changing, at least in Europe, quite a bit. It's not like it used to be that data scientists can be hired for any kind of salary. This is not the case any longer. So I think we have here some shift in perception. So even bigger corporates letting people go, as we all know, and as we heard from the news. There's obviously now a fight for good positions. So it's not like that you can hire basically any job that you like. This is not how it used to be. So this is a very different situation. And companies and corporates are looking for the best candidates with the best cultural fit. So the topic of culture becomes also important. And so I think this is the other bit of it, that at the moment we have a shift, right? We have quite a lot of people in the market, and we have corporates looking for people, looking for candidates, but with a good fit for the team.
Speaking of cultural fit then, what is your general view on that? Is this like, this is almost the most important thing to get right? So I hear people say that. Other people think of it as more like you're just kind of selecting more of the same. Is cultural fit almost like anti-diversity? Is it immeasurable? Is it open to bias? Where do you fit on that kind of spectrum? And what's your thoughts about hiring for culture and how it can be done?
Yeah, I think If you ask me, it is an essential part of the hiring process. So I worked for WL Gore, which is very famous for its culture. It's also a role model for many other companies. And I loved the idea of having a culture not only as a kind of a set of 20 keywords, right? We are open, we are honest, we are inclusive and such thing. This is not culture, by the way, right? So this is not what I'm talking about. Culture is much more an idea how we are going to work together, right? There are processes, for instance, right? There are standards, there are workflows. So culture is much more than just having a nice kind of picture with some values on it. This is not culture. So, and if you take it like this, like that it's really something substantial of how a company works and interacts together, it is very, very important. I just bring the example of Google, right? So Google has since forever kind of a very interesting and dedicated culture, and they are hiring according to this culture. And it's a tech company, obviously. So it is essential for me. Absolutely.
Hiring for culture is essential. How do you interview someone and say, yes, this person feels like they're going to fit in with our culture? Like, what are you really looking for? How are you evaluating that?
When I worked with my startup, and obviously we had a pretty small team, me and my colleague spent a lot of time to define what our culture looked like, right? So first of all, what do we want to achieve? What are our main and core principles of working together? For instance, we agree to disagree. We are working purely agile and so forth. So after we had this in written and as a Confluence documentation, we started to shape out the roles. So who do we look for fitting to this culture that we want to build up? It's not like in a process, in a hiring process where you ask the candidate, are you a good fit or not? But you have to make up your mind before. And then look for the right candidates, because it doesn't make sense to invite 20 guys when you at least know from the beginning that cannot work out because they don't have the mindset. And in the end, it's all the time the question of, do you have the mindset? Are you a good fit for a team working in XYZ?
That is something presumably you're evaluating in the interview itself. Like, do you have a set of questions where you're, for example, saying,
yes,
this question evaluates, I don't know, how adaptable a person is. This one evaluates whether or not they believe in our value of like, make it happen, or whatever the values are. Like, how do you actually go about doing it?
I've been hired myself with such questions, right? In such methodology, for instance, with MBTI testing and stuff. So on the one hand side, yes, I'm a fan of that because I believe that you have to have structured questions all around this cultural fit and mindset. And you can basically come to a point where you say you are pretty confident that this is a good fit. On the other hand side, there's a lot of intuition in this call, in this hiring process involved. So I don't believe that you can replace intuition with 100% questionnaire process where you really ask detailed questions, because there's always a good reason why there's a probation period, right? So probation period means that you have to look if somebody really telling you the truth and is a really good fit for the culture. So yes, of course, there's a structure. There are questions all around that, what you need to hire. But on the other hand side, there's a good amount of intuition. And for example, what we did is we had, of course, single interviews with some of us, with the hiring manager, with myself, with my partner. And then at the end, we had a final round where we had a short conversation with all of us, just to see if all of us agree on what we see. And that brings intuition to a kind of a more scientific level instead of, yes, this is a no, or this is a yes.
Okay, so you basically get to the end and almost have a round table discussion, debate about a candidate or set of candidates where you sort of share your different perspectives and why you thought in a certain way and kind of like challenged each other's thoughts. So even if it wasn't data driven in that sense, it was actually a kind of collective rationalization almost of your thoughts around the candidate.
Yeah. And of course, there are methods. When I was working with Gore, one of my colleagues had a fantastic process for the hiring with a simple Excel chart, right? Data driven, saying those are the values that we want to see. Those are the skills that we want to see. And then everybody could put an X on it and could say, yes, I'm seeing this skill. I'm seeing this qualification. And then at the end, we could look at the Excel together and say, this is at least somehow scientific, somehow data driven. And at least we agree to disagree.
That makes sense. And I'm really interested in going back to kind of the start, because you said, well, there's no point inviting all these candidates in without having first established what the values are. I'm interested to hear exactly how you did that and compare it to how we approached this. Like, was it the case that you made a couple of early hires and you thought, oh, this isn't going to work. These people don't fit in with what I want the company to be. And was it you were then getting it down on paper and saying, like, what are we currently? What do we want to be? Okay, let's hire people for that. Like, what was the almost the origin of taking that approach?
Absolutely. This is of course shaped by experience. Let's put it like this, because in the beginning we just hired data scientists, we just hired tech people. We did not care so much about the soft skills. We did not care so much about anything else beside that you are a Python coder, right? So that's enough. That's good enough. We checked if you have the skills that you tell us, and right, you have a certification. That's enough. Let's go. And obviously, we came to the conclusion that this is not going to work out, because like this, you cannot build trust, you cannot build a working team, and you cannot have the flywheel effect. Absolutely not, because you're just putting people into a box and you hope that it works out, right? And there's no kind of accident or no incidents around that. And obviously, as you imagine, it doesn't work out, right? So sometimes you're lucky and it works out kind of so and so, but most of the time you're not lucky and it simply does not work out because people don't understand each other. And of course, at this very moment, there's things starting to get complex, right? Where you do things that you never did before, team is falling apart. And so, of course, after some time, I think after a year, 1.5 years, we stopped this process and we completely reorganized the company around, as I said before, a Confluence documentation on our values, what we want to do, who we want to be, how we want to work, what are the major milestones. And obviously, we put this also in an onboarding process, right? So that people can see transparently from the beginning what we want to do, what we're up to. That's maybe the most important thing, that also now being back in an employee role after my startup experience, I think that most of the companies miss to really say explicitly what they want, what they expect. They simply hire people a little bit by coincidence, but they never say explicitly what they expect. And I don't say that like you are XYZ and you have to fulfill XYZ. This is what they say, but nothing around that. What mindset do you need? What's your personal profile? What are your strengths and weaknesses? How do you play in the team? What is my personal expectation towards you? This is mostly left out, and then you are in the weeds.
Why is it left out, do you think? Is it that companies just, like, it's a lot of effort to compile that for each role? Maybe they haven't consciously thought about it enough. Maybe it varies by team. Well, why do you think companies neglect this?
Very good question. I think that it's a lot of effort, yes, of course. And there's a lot of conscious debate around that in the existing team. And that takes time. Like hiring always takes time, right? So hiring is a process that takes time because you have to understand why you are hiring people. And most of the time, especially in tech roles, in data science roles, it is kind of a vague idea that we need more resource because we're anyway super busy and this is why we are hiring. Sounds ridiculous, but many companies argue like that. We have a lot of work and we cannot do the work, so let's hire more people, more of the same. Yeah, that's not a conscious process for me. A conscious process would always look like that we are understanding what we're up to, who we are, who we want to be, and how is somebody contributing to who we want to be.
And when you put together those values in that Confluence document, were part of them like, oh, this is where you want the almost aspirational in a sense, and you knew you weren't quite there at the moment? Or was it all things that you felt like, oh, this is our company now. We need people to fit into what we are now?
Actually, it was very descriptive. It was not so aspirational in our case. It could be aspirational, of course, but we were really descriptive. So simply, this is what we are. This is what we want to do. This is how we work. Those are the core processes. This is kind of and something that we really debated. This is a really interesting question. Should we have an organigram? Should we have somebody like a structure? Who's doing what? So we struggled quite a lot of time to think about if a small team really actually needs that. So we came to the conclusion, yes, we need it, and then we did it because we did not want to limit the range and responsibility of people who develop themselves. But
no, that's the nature of a startup, isn't it? If you can get people to, if you don't put them in their box, they can really shine and do amazing things if they're given the right opportunity. You developed this Confluence document, this framework for what your company was and how you worked and your values, and then you used it effectively as a screening tool in hiring. Like ultimately people who you got hired had to fit in with what you're looking for. How early did you expose that in the hiring process? Like, was it something that the candidates could see and opt out themselves of and go, oh, wow, that's what you want me to do. You know what, this culture isn't for me. I won't even continue the process. Or was it something that you kind of kept to yourself and used, as you said, in the interview process and then in onboarding once they joined?
Actually, we kept it to ourselves. We did not share it up front. We shared it in a later stage of the process. I don't know if that was smart. It's simply how we did it. We communicated it. Let's put it like this.
And can you ever remember any candidates who like almost opted out in the interview process, or once they really understood what you're after and how you work, they thought, oh, that's not for me, kind of thing?
We had this. Yeah, we had those situations, especially when we are looking for data scientists. Comes down to a certain let's say, spirit of working. So many of the data scientists are not cut out to work for a startup, because many of the data scientists are used to work for corporations. And I don't have to explain what it means for corporation, meaning the 9-to-5 game, right? So playing the political game, being in an office, fulfilling the rules, looking at what others expect, play your play, don't do anything else. And startup is quite different, right? So there's no 9-to-5. There's pick your own commitments, do what you can do, be open, be transparent. It's very, very different. And so people, yes, do opt out if they see, okay, no, that's not for me.
Yeah, and it's so much better that they've opted out in the hiring process than 3 months into the job where they realize, oh, I hate this and nobody's having a good time. So I think you're onto something, that companies should be more forthcoming with this, because it's going to save everyone a lot of hassle.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But the problem, again, we're coming back to the scarce resource, right? So if the market is looking desperately for resources, everybody's compromising at the moment, at least. Also now the candidates, right? Compromising. And I think that if you ask me honestly, this is a waste of time for everybody, because at the end, everybody's unhappy, for sure.
Yeah, it's the sort of thing that if you're a candidate, you need a gig, you're going to apply to a lot more things than what you would if you're in a market where you've got your pick of the roles. And then I guess they're kind of getting through the interview process by not lying, but kind of lying to themselves in a sense of what they want. But if ultimately they land in a role that's not for them, how long can anyone last at a high level? Maybe a year if they're lucky, but probably a lot less than that.
Yeah, and the next thing is that, can you really fulfill and can you achieve any goals? So if you have very simple, or let's say complicated tasks, I believe that you can achieve some of the goals. But if you have complex tasks to achieve, it will be very, very difficult, at least from my perspective. Only if you have a working team, only if you have a high level of trust. Everybody knows that, right? It's kind of really basic what I'm saying, but still, if you don't have the high level of trust, you have no way of achieving complex tasks. It's simply not possible. And therefore, the mindset and the cultural fit is, again, very, very important. Not simply to hire people who have the capabilities to do something, because capabilities alone don't mean anything.
It's just capabilities, almost like a promise that you could do something, but ultimately you'll have to deliver. What about thinking back to the hiring you've done? Does anything stick out as a particular mistake you've made that you then subsequently changed your process on the back of? Or mistake you've seen someone else make that was like, oh, that did not go well. It was almost predictably bad, and how that ended up?
I did a lot of mistakes, obviously, because you learn only by doing mistakes or by making mistakes. But the mistakes started, obviously, as I said before, we hired really with a focus on tech people at the beginning. So you have to have the capabilities. Everything else doesn't matter so much. So you want to work for us? We are a cool startup. We have this engineering role. Please start. And we did not look into the profile of the person. We did not challenge what the expectation of the profile of the person was. So the candidate needs to have a clear understanding of what their own expectations are. And we did not challenge that. And that was a huge mistake, because later on we saw that we had really issues, especially with one person. We had huge issues. And we could have avoided that. We could have avoided that with a longer discussion and more diligence in the process of hiring, and simply looking at things beside the capabilities. And I saw this many times in my career, right? So, and by the way, sometimes I was hired also not as the perfect fit for a role, simply because my hiring manager thought that, yeah, this will work out. And then we had to rearrange the role and so forth. So the mistakes kind of happened on every level, and I could learn a great deal from that.
It's such a recurring theme that I hear. What I've also noticed is a candidate going through the hiring process, and if they're particularly inquisitive, they might be asking each person they interview, so like, what do you need me to do? Like, what is this role fundamentally about? What are my goals? And what they often get is like quite different answers from different people in the process. So I've noticed a lot of like, it's like they haven't even gotten on the same page before they started. So everyone's kind of got their own view of what this role should be. Is that something you've seen as well?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Many, many times. And exactly this is why we created this Confluence documentation, to be at least on the same side from our perspective. Even, of course, obviously, we are all human beings, and no, we cannot agree on everything. And right, if my tech partner, I was more the CEO role, my partner was more the tech role, we will have different perspective on what we expect from a person. That's fully okay, right? We should not align 100%. This is not possible. But at least to a sufficient degree of 80%. But of course, obviously, the trouble starts, and everybody knows that if you're applying for a role, and then the CEO tells you something, and the hiring manager tells you something, and the legal guy tells you something. And of course, obviously, it happened many, many times to myself, and I saw this many times happening. But this is why I wanted to avoid it, to make clear what our expectations is.
And so then you've basically done your half, and then really it's up to then, it sounds like you've adjusted the hiring process so you unlock the equivalent information from the candidate by really drilling down in those interview processes. Like, okay, what exactly do you want? What are your goals? What are you looking for? Rather than just focusing purely on the technical side of things.
Yeah, exactly. And that's absolutely important. But as you said before, you have to agree on this part as well. So it's not good enough to simply say, yeah, we have a kind of an idea what mindset we are looking for. No, you really have to spell it out, and you have to discuss it.
I guess what do they say? Most of life's disappointments come from a mismatch between expectations and reality. So as long as everyone sets their expectations clearly, then hopefully that makes everyone a little bit happier. What about candidates who, even once you'd optimized or almost recreated this process, where it was not so myopically focused on technical skills, it was like, okay, they need to be able to do the job. They also need to be able to fit into our culture and add some value. Did you then subsequently still find candidates who kind of nailed that cultural fit, behavioral kind of interview, and they just couldn't do the job? Was there still sometimes a disconnect? And if so, looking back, do you know why that was?
Obviously, that can happen. Did this occur to us? Not that I can remember, because we were just not such a big team, right? But obviously, there's also some thing that we call this a progress over time, right? That people change their attitude, kind of affected by certain personal experiences. And yes, of course, now I remember that we had a teammate who had kind of a really difficult situation in the family at a certain stage, and that changes everything, right? So if you are affected by kind of a personal incidents that you could not foresee, obviously this will affect your work life, this will affect your mindset, this will affect many things, right? So nobody's protected. That this will happen maybe sometime, hopefully not, but if it happens, you have to be very open and have to see that you find a solution. So again, what we are looking for most of the time, or what we are looking for in a startup, is somebody who's pretty flexible, who's adaptive to change, because that is something that the whole organization, in my point of view, needs, right? People who are resilient and who are adaptive. There's no other way around in a world that is changing faster and faster, not only technology, but also politically and so forth. So that was one of my major points. Look for people who are resilient and who are adaptive, because you cannot foresee the future, right? So you can have a perfect candidate, hiring process great, probation period great, and after 1 year something happens. And that's what it is.
What about, speaking of technology shifts, so last couple of years, AI has come along. Got ChatGPT out for like 23 months now. Hear a lot of people talking about its impact in the hiring space. What about for the role itself of a data analyst, a data scientist, a data engineer? 5 years is maybe a long way into the future, but like, what impact do you think it's going to have over the next few years? Will a data engineer exist? Will a data analyst exist? Will they be doing sort of 90% of the different work they're currently doing? Like, what if you had an amazing crystal ball? what would you imagine will happen?
My personal, very subjective opinion is that yes, data science roles will exist also in the future, no matter how GPT is taking off. Yes, I agree that GPT is taking over some of the minor or maybe less complicated tasks in programming and coding. Yes, this will change the IT dramatically. I absolutely believe in that. but it will never substitute data science roles. And why is that? I believe personally that we always have to have a good communication between what's technically capable and what the business needs. And therefore, you need to have kind of a bridge or somebody who connects the dots, call it whatever you will. And this person will be needed also in the future, also in 5 and 10 years. Because at the end, AI is made by human beings, right? So still, maybe there's in the future an AI who creates AI, but let's skip that, right? So we think that AI is created by humankind and human beings, and so we need the role of data scientists. And there comes another important point from my end, that I think the whole topic of specific data sets is not solved yet. So we are starting GPT with a, let's say, very generic, very global data set. Okay, but the future is the specific data sets. Industry-specific data sets, topic-specific data sets, let's say very high quality, very high quantity as well, for certain languages, for certain topics and cultures and so forth. And here lies a huge potential for data scientists. And I cannot imagine that we can automate this from scratch.
And so do you think now in data, I don't know, the equivalent of 30 years ago in engineering, where there was, this emergence of more and more specific roles, back-end engineer, front-end engineer, DevOps, and there was a spin out of all these jobs that really didn't exist 30 years ago once the technology got to a certain state and it was complex enough. Would you imagine a similar kind of thing with data? I guess we've already seen that in the last 10 years with analyst, scientist, engineer, etc. Is it going to kind of go further that way, do you imagine?
Yeah, I can imagine that this progress will continue for some time. The question is always, do we reach at a certain stage a plateau? We are not in an accelerating phase of change. But for a certain stage, I'm pretty confident that this will change, as said, because we will have a big impact of automation on the IT department itself. Today, structured with CTO, with DevOps engineers, data scientists, and so forth. And this will change dramatically in the future because, it can be done easier, it can be done cheaper, and that's it.
What about, again, thinking holistically about candidates you've interviewed in the past? There must be hundreds for different roles.
Maybe not hundreds, but a few.
Quite a few. Are there particular, or have there been particular areas that differentiate the successful from unsuccessful? I'm assuming, based on how you developed your hiring process, that those who fell down were those who weren't fitting in with that culture, and that was the most common thing. But perhaps there are other reasons that led to candidates failing to get those roles.
Yeah, so this is a very good one. I think one thing that is really sticking out is for me the commitment and the reliability. So I see many candidates having excellent skills or having also decent soft skills, but they are not reliable and they show no commitment, and quite from the beginning. They're doing an interview, a really interesting company, really I would love to work for that. Yeah, okay, follow up in 2 weeks, no reply. Many, many times candidates show that they have basically no real interest in working for a company. They don't have the proper commitment for the hiring process itself. And that's an absolute no-go for me personally. So that people applying for a job, meaning I don't ask them, they apply for me. And then due to any reason, they skip it.
Is it that they've gotten another role, or this is candidates who've applied and just said, I don't have the wherewithal to go through this process?
I don't know. I cannot really answer that. Maybe both, a little bit of both.
If you think about it, it's amazing because, as you said, these are candidates who've applied. You haven't outreached to them. They've come inbound. And they're one of the relatively lucky ones to get some interest, which is already putting them in the 1% bucket of people, because most people are at the moment complaining about not getting any callbacks, but they've gotten the interest. And at that point, they can't follow through. That's really fascinating and surprising to me anyway.
It is surprising, yes. But at the end, it comes down to, I personally think so, that people did not make up their mind what they are really looking for. So basically, they jump on every occasion, not thinking, is this occasion the right one for me? Is this really the job that I'm looking for? Is this really the company that I'm looking for? Still, many candidates, and I'm sad to say that, fail to research the company they are applying for, right? So if you ask them, what do we do? Kind of this and that. Yeah, but just look at the website, So this takes you 5 minutes at least, maybe 10 minutes, 20 minutes to understand what we are doing and what we are up for. And so maybe you can ask questions that are specifically on the topic. And this is something that is still really interesting to me.
I have heard, so there are some products out there now, they seem to have reached a maturity in the United States that would allow a candidate to apply en masse to roles using AI, filling in the application forms. I wonder then if it's like the cost of applying now is almost zero. Candidates applying to more roles than they do on average. So then each one they've applied to, they're kind of less committed in a sense than they would be if they had to go through the process themselves.
Very, very interesting, very likely, honestly. Because obviously everybody knows that the probability of coming to a first call is really not zero, but it's really not 100%, of course, not a 50% even. So it makes sense to automate the process. But that's also an interesting side effect of AI, right?
Yeah, it's going to be this really weird race to the bottom. So it's like candidates like, oh, I can't get a call back. I better automate this process to, maximize my chances. That then thereby reduces how interested they are in each one. The companies, they're like, oh, I'm getting inundated with applications. I better automate the screening process. There's going to be a weird automation game happening on either side, I imagine.
Yeah, exactly. Because the company also have an AI process in place to filter out exactly those candidates. So if they are filtering out those candidates, again, the effort is zero, on both sides. The effect is not existing, at least not a positive effect on having the right people doing the right stuff.
That'll be this weird scenario where there'll be like this vanity metric of this job has attracted 100,000 applicants, and me as a candidate, I've applied for 10,000 jobs, but it'll be completely meaningless because it'll just be mass applications getting screened out by AI at zero marginal cost. What a weird world we're entering. What about on the other side of the table? So if you think about the different roles you've applied to in the past yourself as a candidate, were there any particularly good or bad hiring experiences that you went through, and what made them memorable?
Yeah. So one of the experiences that I liked a lot is the hiring process of WL Gore. WL Gore, with its unique culture, is, I guess, pretty known around the globe. And I like this process because it contained a lot of culture at the beginning. So candidates were filtered and screened for a good fit for culture, and that was made transparently at the beginning. So you had several hiring managers talking to you and coming together as a committee. And so doing exactly what I later did myself. So I like this very much, this process, and I still think until today it's a very good way to find decent candidates for the things that you want to achieve. Obviously, nobody's perfect, and this process could also be flawed sometime. But at the end, overall, I think it's a very, very good process. I was also working for agencies. Here, the hiring process was very different, I must say. So it was very much driven by the like or dislike of a CEO. So if you have one hiring manager who's basically the CEO who hires you because he likes you, it's a biased process. And this is also part of my experience.
What about, do you have any thoughts over interviews themselves as like a selection tool? Because there does seem to be some evidence that inherently they're a little bit biased towards, I don't know, good looking, tall people. If you're still having a face-to-face interview, extroverts, people who are like, really excited and talk a big game and are really pumped, which is often not the best data candidate, for example. Any thoughts about kind of over-relying on interviews in a sense in the hiring process?
Yeah, obviously, most companies don't have a lot of creativity to come to the conclusion that the interview is important. I would never skip an interview, at least not a personal interview. So the least thing that you do is a video call. The personal interview is very, very important because you feel the person, right? Sitting in the room, you have a good idea on the energy the person is spreading. But of course, as you said, there's always some bias to that. And so a good way to correct it from my end is to give every candidate a task. And this is something that I also enjoyed in some of my application processes as a candidate, that obviously the company provided me with a task to solve. Because like a typical task, right, that as an engineer or a data scientist, it's pretty easy to come up with a task that you want them to solve. And by reviewing the task, you can see already how dedicated, how diligent, how fast, how smart a person is. And there helps no boasting, no good looking, no nothing. So this is a good correction tool from my perspective, but of course not making the interview unnecessary, but it's still a necessary part.
What about hiring in general? Hiring, recruitment tends to be done, I think, like if you imagine a spectrum of like pure data driven to pure intuition. I feel like most companies would hire a lot further towards the intuition side of the spectrum. This is even for data roles, even data people hiring data roles whose whole world is about data. Do you think there's some inherent reason for that? Is it just that like hiring people is such a subjective thing? It's not it's so far from a science, you can't really use a data-driven approach? Or what are your thoughts on that intuition versus data-driven approach in hiring in particular?
I think there's a very simple reason to that. We are missing the tools. Of course, a part is, as I can see, I'm not in HR, never worked in HR, I have to say, but I can see that GDPR makes a difference, obviously, because you're working with personal related data of people. So that makes it kind of hard to automate the process. But I still think a main reason why we are not working data driven in this field is because we don't have the tools. And if you would have the tools, definitely it could look pretty different. I know that there are tools coming, but I know that the HR departments all worked really manually. There was no automation in place.
And like when you say the tools, this would be what, like, is it partly the data? We don't have access to the data points that would help us hire the right person, or is it more the tooling to analyze the data that we do have? Like
analyzing the data that we have, for instance, like video application, screening candidates on videos, if they are a good fit or yes or no. But at the end, the problem with the data is that, like with training sets in AI, you have to prepare kind of a gold standard at the beginning. And if you don't have the gold standard, what do you want to have the other data for, right? So what is my gold standard? What I want to hire for, right? So what are the most important things that I want to see? What are our processes? What are our expectations for each role and so forth? And if I have this gold standard available for the company and for each role, obviously I can start collect data and see if there's a match or not. But that would be my number one step.
it sounds like, yeah, some of this data is available. Some of the tools are maybe around the corner. Can you imagine, let's say in a few years' time, that in hiring, we'd revert to the other end of the spectrum where it's like, well, this tool has given us like 90% a picture of the right candidate. And it's just like a final human level decision just to add a little bit of intuition to it or some kind of value add. Can you imagine it going almost to the other end of the spectrum, kind of like marketing is at the moment or anything else?
I don't know. I don't think so, honestly, because at the end, it's people working with people, right? So this is a little bit like in sales. People always buy from people. Yeah, we can automate sales. Obviously, everybody knows that. But at the end, people buy from people and people work with people. And so there's no way to overcome that aside from reducing the people to zero and saying, okay, this is a fully automated process in our company. We don't need any human being at all. This could happen. But always, if we have a team of two, we have to look that there's a fit between the two. And if they are all the day and each day at each other's throats, we have a problem due to any reason, right? Because they are not a good fit. They culturally very different, different expectations, whatever. Yeah, we don't know. So there's always an irrational component in this whole game when people work with people.
You'd mentioned some previous companies where the hiring process was done really well. What about any individuals? Like, is there anyone in the past you can think of who you personally learned a lot from in the way that they approached hiring?
I think that my colleague in my startup was mainly responsible for our staff and for our employees, and he did quite a good job, I must say, because he had the idea of coming up with this Confluence documentation and so forth that we discussed earlier. So I think for me, he's a really, really good guy, also coming from a process point of view and hiring people more data-driven. Also, my colleague I talked about at WL Gore, she was also really good because she was the first person I ever met to structure a hiring process and not just having random questions. So yeah, those are maybe my two hiring heroes.